Hello, everyone. Today's lesson concerns the human urinary system, a system that gets rid of waste that the body cells actually produce, and if it accumulates in your body, can actually cause sickness and death. It's a very important system. So let's take a look at the anatomy of the human urinary system. Very simple. It has a blood supply coming down from the aorta, from the heart, and then it branches into two arteries, which are kind of short, called the renal arteries. Renal is a word that actually has to do with the kidneys. The renal arteries go into the right and left kidney. There's a right and left renal artery. The kidneys then clean the blood of the waste that we'll be talking about today. And then the cleaner blood leaves the kidneys through the renal veins, which hook up to the inferior vena cava and then back up to the heart. And that keeps going on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to filter out the waste in the blood. Now, what is that waste? Well, if you think about it, you eat a lot of protein. And proteins, as you remember, contain or actually made of amino acids joined together in big long chains. Each amino acid has what they call an amino group of atoms on it. The amino group of atoms are nitrogen and two hydrogens. When you use an amino acid for food, if you burn it up in the mitochondria for energy, you have to remove that amino group first. That is N with two H's. When you remove the amino group, the bond that's broken gets another H put onto it. So you end up with NH3. And NH3 is a very poisonous substance in animal bodies called ammonia. And that ammonia will then accumulate in your blood as you continue eating proteins and digesting the amino acids and using them for energy in the mitochondria. The ammonia then goes to the liver, and the liver is one of its most important jobs is to convert the ammonia into a less poisonous substance, a much less poisonous substance called urea. And then the urea then is released from the liver, goes back into the blood, and then goes to the kidneys for removal from the body. So one of the major jobs the kidneys have is to remove that nitrogenous waste, or waste that contains ammonia, that actually contains nitrogen. That would be ammonia and urea, and remove it from the body. Also, the kidneys' other major job is to remove any excess water in the blood, so it actually controls your blood pressure. Anytime you drink water or anything that contains water, the water ends up in your bloodstream eventually, and that can increase your blood pressure. And so if your blood pressure goes up, the brain sends a message to the kidneys to remove more of the water, and then the water comes out of your body as part of the urine. So the kidneys are also controlling the water balance in your body as well as the ammonia and urea balance. There are other poisonous wastes that are removed from the kidneys too, or other wastes that are sometimes not poisonous. And one of them is actually some of the breakdown products of your dead red blood cells, and that's what makes the urine that sort of a yellowish color. Once the waste is removed from the blood, the urine, which contains the urea and other things, leave the kidneys through the ureters. Now, the ureters are long tubes that lead from the kidney down your body into the bladder. There's one ureter for each kidney. And once they get into the bladder, they fill the bladder with urine. And when the bladder expands, it sends a message to the brain that you need to pee. And when you do, the sphincter muscles at the base of the bladder open, and you expel the urine through a tube called the urethra. The urethra is going right through the penis in a male and out of the body through the female. In a male, the urethra goes directly through the prostate gland. So some men, as they get older, their prostate glands is not cancer now. The prostate glands just simply swell. And when they do, it has to do with changing hormones in the man as he gets older. As the prostate swells, it can squeeze the urethra and make it more difficult for the man to urinate. And that could be a problem because it could build up the urine in the body and build up reduce the ability of the kidneys to do their job. And so what happens sometimes is that you have to have either pills to reduce the size of the prostate, or even an operation to cut a part of it out so that the urine can leave the body. Now, if you go to the next slide here, you see that the blood will flow down the aorta from the heart into the right and left renal arteries, like I said. It enters the kidneys through the renal arteries, which quickly branch to over 1 million little tiny arteries inside of the kidney. It's a tremendous number of arteries, very, very small, microscopically small. Each little artery is called an arteriole, and each one ends in something called a nephron. The nephron is the actual filter that filters the material out of the blood. The blood is cleaned of most of the urea, some salt, and it loses some of its water. And then the cleaner blood leaves the kidneys through the renal veins, and the renal veins then carry the cleaner blood back into the inferior vena cava, back to the heart again, to go around the body. Now, remember, each one of those million little arteries leads to a nephron. And the nephron is going to clean the blood that's in those arteries. And we're going to take a look now and see how that works. Here's a picture, actually, of an actual dissected kidney system. And you see the two kidneys. One of them's actually opened up, and you can see those little pyramids inside. We'll talk about those later on. And you can see here that if I get my pointer working, you can see that these are the two kidneys. And here's the ureter that empties the urine down into the bladder down here. And there's the other one on the other side. And here's the various blood vessels, the renal arteries and veins that go into and out of the kidneys. This slide just shows you a little bit about what's inside the kidneys. Here's the two of them. And you see one kidney is a little bit higher than the other in your body. And what happens is that when you get into the kidney, you see these little pyramids, and inside those pyramids are these nephrons. The nephrons are these whitish-looking tubes that are going to be cleaning the blood. And again, we'll talk about that in the next slide. And this is a good picture of one of those nephrons. It looks complicated, but when we talk about it on the next slide, you'll see how it actually works. Here's my diagram of a nephron. This is the way that the kidneys actually clean your blood. Here is a little tiny arteriole, a little branch from the renal artery. Now, this would be a very, very small thing in the kidney. There's millions of these in the kidneys. This is just one of them. Each kidney has millions of nephrons. And one tiny branch of the artery, a little arteriole, ends in this little ball of capillaries here, see? That little ball of capillaries there is called a glomerulus. It is that the pressure inside the blood is such that it will actually squeeze fluids out of the glomerulus into this sort of C-shaped catcher, right through those little cells there, into these tubes. It squeezes just like a filter. And remember, what goes through a filter depends on what the sizes of the particles are. So this is not something that determines what's good and what's bad. It's just basically done by size. So all the small molecules that are in the blood can actually squeeze out of here and end up in this collecting, what they call Bowman's capsule area here. And what happens is that a lot of water is removed here, a lot of urea, a lot of salts, and other small molecules, like even some ammonia, and other things that are small, even maybe glucose and amino acids too, the things you don't want to lose in your body. Remember, you ate all the food and you digested the food to make them the proteins into amino acids and the starches into glucose, and then you're trying to get it to the blood so that you can have it for food and energy and everything. You don't want to end up peeing your glucose and amino acids out after all of that. But because the glucose and amino acids are small molecules, they can squeeze through these little capillary walls here in the glomerulus and into the nephron. And if you follow the nephron, you can see as I go around down into the kidney and then back up again, it's whatever's in there has a possibility to end up in the ureter, which is going to lead to the bladder, which is going to lead to the toilet bowl. So you don't want to, pee out all of your good stuff as well as the bad stuff. But that's what comes out here because it's just based on size. So what happens here in the glomerulus is that the blood pressure in the blood actually squeezes these small molecules out of the blood and into this little collector, the Bowman's capsule. And then what happens is that the renal filtrate, what's filtering out of the glomerulus, this liquid which contains lots of small molecules, will go through the nephron and start going up and down here like a roller coaster. And that's called a proximal, because it's close to the beginning, the proximal convoluted, because it goes up and down, tubule. And you'll see in the proximal convoluted, in the next few slides, you'll see what happens at each one of these places. It goes after through the proximal convoluted tubule. The fluid actually goes down into the kidney, really, really deep into this big loop, and then back up again. This is called the loop of Henle, Henle. There's a descending portion and an ascending portion. And you can see that all of these tubes here are surrounded by blood vessels. All of these these dark lines here are blood vessels. And then what happens is that the fluid then goes, what's left over now, goes to the distal convoluted tubule, and some more stuff is done to it there, and we'll talk about that. Then it's all put into this collecting tube. The collecting tube collects fluid from many nephrons, actually, and you can see there's another one coming in here. And then the collecting tube eventually leads to the ureter, which goes down into the bladder to be filled up with urine. So let's see what happens at each one of these places. All right, the glomerulus. The high pressure in the glomerulus, the blood pressure, in fact, they think it's one of the highest capillary blood pressures in your body, forces fluid across the epithelium cells of the Bowman's capsule into the nephron. So you can see here is your little artery, and here is the small artery that branches off of that. This is the glomerulus here. They call it that because it looks like a little globe. It says GLO, just like the word globe. And the material is squeezed out through these little epithelial cells into the actual nephron tubule. Remember that what's coming out of here is lots and lots of water and all the other small molecules in your blood, that some of which you don't want to get rid of. And then what is being filtered out? Water, salts. Salts are small molecules too. They go right through it. Urea, thank goodness that we get rid of that. Glucose and amino acids, unfortunately, are also squeezed out of there, and an assortment of other small molecules, including some vitamins. This is called a renal filtrate, what's squeezing out of those little glomeruli. Then we get to this next one here. This is what's happening at the proximal convoluted tubule. Well, once the fluid leaves the Bowman's capsule, it goes up and down in this little proximal tubule, all surrounded by blood vessels. Now here, there's some ammonia that's still in the blood, can be added to the renal filtrate. There's a yellowish fluid that's moving through the nephron here, at the proximal convoluted tubule, and other poisons can be added to it from the blood, especially if you had taken drugs. Some of those drugs, like marijuana and others, can go into the urine there. And hydrogen ion balance means you're adjusting the pH of the fluid so that when it finally ends up as urine, it doesn't come out too acidy or too basic. And you want it to be a little bit just basically neutral. Very important here now. At the proximal convoluted tubule, the body uses energy, ATP energy, to pump the glucose and amino acids back into the blood. Here is where you don't lose them. Right away, as soon as those amino acids and glucose, the goodies, from your digestion, get here, they're pumped back into the blood right away. So you don't lose them. And also about 70% of all the water that leaks out of here goes put into the blood too. And by the way, if all the water that leaked out of all your millions of glomeruli in your kidneys actually ended up in your urine, you would never stop peeing. You could probably pee yourself to death. There'd be so much water coming out of there. You'd fill up your bladder probably just about as fast or faster than you can pee it out. That's how much water is coming out of these glomeruli. So it's very important that the proximal tubule here right away, that 70+% of all of that water and salt is put back into the blood. You don't want to lose all of that stuff. And also the glucose and amino acids are put back into. So very important events here that happen in the proximal tubule. Return of the glucose and amino acids back to the blood, most of the water and most of the salt back into the blood as well. Then we get to the loop of Henle. You have a descending loop here. The walls of the descending loop here are very permeable to water. That means as this fluid, which already lost 70% of the water that came out of the glomeruli and was put back into the bloodstream, as it moves down here, more water comes out through these cells and into the bloodstream. So you end up with more water being diffused back into the blood. So that's good. You don't want to, again, you don't want to lose all the water that's coming out of the glomeruli. So in the descending loop, you're putting more water in. In the ascending loop, coming the other way, this one coming up this way, you have the a place where you're putting a lot of salt back into the blood. Again, you don't want to lose your sodium and your potassium. You know how important they are, calcium, things like that. You want to put all those things back in the blood. So because salt is coming out here and is being put back in the blood, this area between the loops gets very salty, and that draws more water out of this side. So you see how the structure is making it actually work better. So the water is leaving in the descending loop here because the ascending loop making the salt come out of the renal filtrate and being eventually put back into the blood, making the tissues here very salty, and that makes the water from this side actually leak out even more. Water travels toward the salt, and you end up losing more water from the filtrate and putting it back into the blood. And then you end up here at the the distal convoluted tubule here at the other side. And here what you're going to do is you're going to make sure that the sodium and potassium ions in your bloodstream are just where they're supposed to be. You can't have anything too high and too low. You remember about equilibrium. And so if the sodium and ions and potassium ions are just not right, at the distal tubule, you will adjust that into your blood and put sodium in or potassium in or sodium out or potassium out as your blood needs it to keep the sodium and potassium at equilibrium in your bloodstream at levels they're supposed to be at. Also, again, here you're making sure that the pH is just right so that your urine is not too acidic or basic. And then we get to the collecting tube. When we get to the collecting tube, collects the filtrate from many nephrons. Now here, a hormone from your brain, antidiuretic hormones, actually made by the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary gland, that will travel through your bloodstream and affect the ability of the walls of the collecting duct to put water back into your blood. The more ADH you make, the more water will be reabsorbed back into the blood at the collecting tube. So the more ADH you make, the less actual urine you'll produce because most of the water will be putting back in. If you make less ADH, then more water will continue going through the tube into your bladder, and you'll make more urine. So you can control the amount of urine you make here by your ADH. Now the ADH, or the antidiuretic hormone, is basically controlled by your blood pressures. If your blood pressure is very high, you want to make more urine and pee it out so that your blood liquid would go down and your pressure would go down. And the opposite is true. If your blood pressure is very low, you want to make sure the opposite. So you control the amount of urine here at the collecting tube. So if you are drinking, let's say, bar, and you have one beer after another, pretty soon your next stop is going to be the bathroom, because what's happening here is that your blood pressure is going up because all that liquid, especially water, in the beer is going into your bloodstream and causing the pressure in your blood vessels to rise. That's going to cause your body to make less ADH, and therefore you're going to make more urine. Because you make less ADH at the collecting tube, you will allow the what's left over water to keep going and not be reabsorbed back in the blood, and that'll fill up your bladder pretty quickly, and you'll be removing that water from the beer fairly quickly, so you don't affect your blood pressure too much. If you're in a desert, you want to make less urine, so you make a lot more ADH. Now, if you look at the collecting tubule here, that's where the ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, works. The more ADH, the more water is reabsorbed back into the blood, and less goes to the urea, so you'll make urethra, so you'll make less urine. It works opposite. The more ADH you make, the less urine you make. And then The less ADH you make, now what that will do is it will make the water be the less ADH you make, the more urine you'll make. So you'll make more water keeping going down into the ureter and less going back into your blood. In other words, the ADH can control the permeability of the tube here to water. The more ADH you make, the less water will go back in the blood, the more urine you'll make. The more ADH you make, the less urine you'll make. And so you can control that by taking, the amount of ADH your brain makes. It's very important to control the amount of urine, so that's the way you can control your blood pressure. You see? Just think of it opposite. The more ADH or anti-diuretic hormone you make, think of it, it says anti-diuretic. Anti-diuretic means make less urine. So the more anti-diuretic hormone you make, the less urine you'll make. And you'll try to conserve water in your body. Like if you're in the desert and you don't want to lose too much water, and you'll pee just, maybe a little bit every day. If you want to drink, if you're drinking a lot of liquids and you're making the blood pressure in your body go up, you want to make more urine, so you'll make less ADH, and that will create more. It will make more of the water going to the ureter instead of back in the blood, and that will lower your blood pressure and make you have more urine. Okay. Now the urine itself is the resulting fluid of all of this. After all this stuff happens at all the different parts of the nephron, in the proximal convoluted tubule, the loops of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting duct, the result of what's left over is urine. You make about 1.5 liters a day, which travels through the ureters and fills the bladder. The bladder is emptied through the urethra tube, and there's little sphincter muscles you can relax. They're involuntary, and you can actually empty the bladder that way. Now, if you let all the water that came out of these millions of glomeruli you have in your kidneys not be put back into the blood in any of those stages, you can actually make 180 liters of water per day that your kidneys can remove. Now, obviously, you have much less blood than that, so you could actually die from this. So it's very, very important that you put your water back in the blood, most of it back in the blood. Most of the water is resorbed at the proximal convoluted tubules, the descending loops of Henle, and the collecting ducts. And these three places, 99 or 90+%, depending on your situation and your blood pressure, is put back into the blood for you. And that's the story of how your urinary system works. So what I'm going to do next time is I'm going to make a recording on the reproductive system, and that will be our last one. All right. We'll do that next time.